I'd like to thank Wayne and the RCMC team for this kind invitation, for me at a particularly important juncture for the European museums community. When I was invited, to be frank, because of the nature of my work at the moment, I didn't have any idea what I would speak about. But when I read the program, it was very clear to me, especially the summary about this panel, as to what I needed to address. And I use those words carefully. And that is particularly that sentence, it was legal according to the law at that time. And this is why in the abstract I say, according to whose law? That of the conqueror, because the laws of war were changing and looting was not sanctioned under these new rules. The law of the peoples from whom it was taken, that is the material culture, that was and remains, there remains little cognizance that these peoples always had their own customs and laws. So my challenge to you today is to understand that international law, like museum collections, is constructed through choices concerning selection, preservation, presentation and interpretation. Indeed, their present-day forms are driven by many of the same forces and processes which commenced in the 19th century and continue with us today. They may have been adapted and are often hidden, but they remain. The words we use, whether it's colonisation or colonialism, is presumptuous with the assertion that we are in a post-colonial period. It is problematic because it is not the lived experience of many of the peoples and individuals worldwide. It is my contention that international law and museum collections, particularly those established in the 19th and early 20th centuries, are potent, mutually reinforcing vessels and indeed exemplars of the stories we tell ourselves. They were and remain a vital part of the narrative of colonisation. To acknowledge that these stories are indeed manufactured requires that us, and indeed we are all to varying degrees complicit, to revisit, consider deeply and re-examine what we do and how we do it. Whether that be international law or anthropology, history or any other attendant form of narration related to museums and museum collections. So my paper challenges that perennial conclusion concerning the legality around the acquisition of museum collections in order that we are able to have this discussion which must be had. So I will look at the relationship between European museums and this casting of a critical eye on the colonial past to understand that international law today is undergoing that same process around our complicity concerning these processes. Then I will look at the intervention of Indigenous peoples in contemporary international law to explore how museums and societies in which they are located may facilitate their efforts to and how they are represented in these collections to realise their human rights more effectively. And finally, I'll draw very loosely on the work of Avishai Maglit in relation to how we have a duty to remember in relation to the idea of a decent society. So let me turn now to the first part of my talk, which is the emphasis on the rationalising forces which drove the creation of the vast collections of what are self-described universal museums, whether it be the British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And I would actually put ethnographic collections in other metropolitan centres in this same category. That is, that they all fuelled and were fuelled by the ideas of standardisation and universalisation of the laws of nations into international law in the 19th and early 20th century. Prior to this, so prior to the 1850s, there was no pretence as to the universality of the law of nations. However, as the century progressed, with the notions of and the rationalising schemes around statehood, civilisation and the legitimation of the acquisition of territories and other possessions gathered momentum. So what we have, and indeed, and I know your own disciplines have this, is its emphasis on it being a science. We have this same drive in relation to international law. It's the emphasis on objectivity and rationality. So similarly, like your own disciplines of archaeology, anthropology, or indeed others, ethnography, international law pushed itself forward objectively as a science. And like other disciplines, it prepared textbooks, journals, scholarly societies, chairs and courses of study to promote this reformalisation or way of thinking. The articulation of this relationship between the metropolitan centres and the peoples beyond it can best be illustrated, and due to my laziness and lack of preparedness, I'm not able to illustrate this, but take it as a given that the table of contents of leading international law textbooks at this time, in effect, reflected the layout of the international exhibitions which were also being held and then became part of the collections of the museums which we speak today. So at specific junctures at the 1850s, 1890s, and then around the Berlin Conference of 1885, and then the early 1900s, and the scramble for colonial territory, not just in Africa, but the Middle East, Asia and the Pacific, where it increased in earnestness towards the various ways of independence and decolonisation to the present day. The reflections on and the changes in museums, collections and the interpretations of those are equally reflected in the way that international law textbooks describe those relations. So what was previously, and I'm certainly able to elaborate on this more fully later on, were a fuzzy relationship or unclear relationship between the metropolitan centre and all other peoples, when it became co-opted into Darwin's work on evolution concerning animals and plants, and to explain cultural diversity amongst peoples through the writings of Herbert Spencer, who coined the terms survival of the fittest and social Darwinism, international law textbooks became more explicitly and rigidly and comprehensively started to cover all peoples and all territories. No longer were there any qualms about advocating international law's universal application defined by civilised nations and to cover bringing all peoples, their territories and resources within their purview. It was accompanied by legal principles which further justified the colonial project, such as terra nullius, to rationalise territorial grabs, civilising mission, to moderate its excesses through spreading the benefits of modernity through assimilation, which resulted in further devastating loss of culture, language and kinship ties. This new story was heavily dependent on advocating and reinforcing a world view, which was likewise reflected in the exhibits at the now overtly colonial international exhibitions, and the burgeoning museums in metropolitan centres, stocked with material cultures from every corner of the globe. They translated and evidenced in material form the newly reconfigured relationship between the metropolitan centre and the periphery. It was also expressed as a narrative of progression to this civilised European present, with tools and implements likewise displayed, and Tony provided a wonderful example of this yesterday, to reinforce its logic, objectivity and inevitability. People and their cultures were graded along this trajectory, assessed as to their capacity to eventually attain the level of civilisation required by modernity. This relational schema of civilisation was encapsulated in the tiered mandated system of the League of Nations, prepared by South African no more. In response to US President Woodrow Wilson's call for the recognition of self-determination, it provided a supervised way forward to independence for some colonised peoples, while others disappeared, assimilated into the territories of colonial powers or their settler states. This narrative and the policies and the practices it hides or justifies was all pervasive and continues to have significant implications for the way international law is framed today. Indeed, I would say that at significant junctures in the development of international law, that relationship between Indigenous peoples and particularly settler states has defined the way that international law has developed, including most recently with the adoption of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where only Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United States voted against it in the UN General Assembly. Again, this dynamic was replicated at the international colonial exhibitions, and I won't elaborate on that because most of you, given that it is your area of expertise, are aware of that and the way that that was framed to justify that logic around the movement towards civilisation being defined, as I said, in the metropolitan centre. This tension between assimilation and self-determination continued through various ways of decolonisation and independence movements, from the League to, as I said, the adoption of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. What I would emphasise, though, is that these dominant narratives of the metropolitan centre were always preceded by and informed by resistance by peoples on the periphery to these processes and their ongoing survival. Their advocacy targeted not only the formulation and application of laws, including international law, to their peoples, but also the fate of their material culture, which continued to be dislocated, removed and misrepresented. Repatriation claims, including of ancestral remains, sacred objects, material and intangible heritage, then and now disrupted and continue to disrupt the stories of holding museums and the dominant culture's endeavours to tell their stories. The stories of dying cultures, tales of cultures and peoples unable to withstand the onslaught of modernity, of cultures frozen in an immemorial past, began to fray at the edges. Likewise, in the 20th century, as the 20th century unfolded, the membership of the international community of states which made up the UN moved beyond European states and their settler states. International law then reluctantly also divested itself of increasingly unsustainable narratives. The concept of terra nullius was gradually rejected by the International Criminal Court in a series of cases involving decolonisation in Western Sahara. It could no longer be squared with the acknowledgement of the right to self-determination and the prohibition against racial discrimination as preemptory norms. This movement also occurred at the national level, for example with the Mabo decision by the Australian High Court involving the recognition of native title within the Australian common law and the continued presence of Indigenous peoples in the Torres Strait. However, the League of Nations mandate scheme, which had assimilated Indigenous peoples into settler states, also meant that they were not recognised as part of the formal decolonisation process which was implemented by the UN. This has had significant implications for Indigenous peoples within settler states. Nonetheless, Indigenous peoples continue to agitate for the right to self-determination and their seat at the table, internationally and nationally, for their stories to be heard concerning vitality and resilience of their peoples and their cultures. I'd like to now explore that concept and how it is manifest in the late 20th and early 20th centuries by focusing on the recent exhibitions, which were mentioned by Tony in his talk yesterday, hosted by the British Museum in 2015 and the National Museum of Australia, and the processes leading up to the adoption of and the implementation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples nearly a quarter century after of drafting and negotiations. The colonial collections acquired not only the material cultures of peoples and individuals whose territories they occupied, but their skeletal remains and sacred objects, again as part of a scientific drive to evidence the human evolution and cultures. This racialised and the racist overtones of these endeavours cannot be denied. To highlight the difference and the divergent interpretations of these takings and their significance, Indigenous peoples speak of ancestral remains, or more specifically, ancestors, many of whom remain within the stores of metropolitan and national museums. Indigenous peoples have been seeking the repatriation of their ancestors since at least the 1970s, when they stood in protest on the steps of major Australian museums and pursued litigation for their return. This agitation and litigation coincided with growing demands for land rights and a treaty between Indigenous peoples. This, as I mentioned earlier, reached a peak in the 1990s with the Mabo decision and at the international level with the draft Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Both of these legal milestones carried over onto and indeed were informed by the culture and material culture of Indigenous peoples. So, for example, in the Mabo proceedings, it relied not only heavily on the oral testimony of the litigants themselves from the Torres Strait, but also material culture recordings and records gathered by anthropologists and ethnographers in the 19th and 20th centuries, which continue to be held in the collections of the Anthropological and Archaeological Museum at Cambridge University. Likewise, with their heavy involvement of Indigenous representatives, including the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, the peak Australian body, Indigenous body, the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations reflected the priorities and concerns of these peoples, including the recognition of their right to self-determination, right to land and to culture through a draft declaration on specifically dealing with their human rights, and a specialist instrument covering their cultural heritage. These were prepared and indeed adopted finally by the UN in 2007. That instrument specifically refers to and I know quite often it's been said that it is a soft law instrument and non-binding. I can tell you that many aspects of that are binding by way of customary international law. There are specific articles dealing with the right to culture, including effective mechanisms for restitution of property, cultural property, religious property and spiritual property removed without free, prior informed consent or in violation of their laws, traditions and customs, and Indigenous peoples' rights to their manifestation of their spiritual traditions, including access to and control over ceremonial objects and the right to repatriation of human remains and revitalisation of language. I've noticed that I've had the time course, so I'll go through and specifically address the exhibition which Tony spoke about at some length yesterday, and I'll address it only in relation to what I'm covering in my talk. So the National Museum of Australia has often been seen as ground zero in relation to the contestation between what Indigenous Australians are seeking and the then government. This is in the late 1990s and early 2000s, efforts on revisionism of what came to be known as, and some of you may be familiar with this, the history wars. So it has become, this is the National Museum, an important site for the display and debate of and education around its remit, that is the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Now, the exhibition that Professor Bennett referred to yesterday originated from a grant from the Australian Research Council, which was precipitated, and this might be of interest to you, by the British Museum putting online information about their collections in relation to Indigenous Australian materials. So there were twin, and this is indeed what Professor Bennett referred to, there were twin exhibitions. Most of the objects on display, especially the historic ones, came from BM's collections. The British Museum collection exhibition entitled Indigenous Australia Enduring Civilisation, and it specifically states in that title that it was paid for by British Petroleum, plays both on the notions of a living resilient culture and also their weathering of European civilisation. The exhibit and its catalogue was very much tailored for the visitors of the Metropolitan Centre, but one in which Indigenous peoples as museum officials and researchers, such as Gay Sculthorpe, were actively and centrally involved. And the introduction to this speaks to their efforts to make the visitors at the Metropolitan Centre aware of the nature of Indigenous culture and their interactions with non-Indigenous peoples on the Australian continent from 1788, the first date of British white settlement, until the present day. Now, in relation to this, Gay Sculthorpe in her conclusion says that the increasing engagement of Indigenous Australians with museums since the 1980s has resulted in the transformation of museum practices and new and creative ways of working with museum artefacts. Knowledge of particular items and photographs have been increased through documentation by traditional owners. Objects are being used as important sources of information and cultural objects, and contemporary artists have begun to interrogate museum collections and their histories and practices. I don't have time, but the actual exhibition itself and this project was very much precipitated by a repatriation claim, and I'm happy to speak to that if there is questions around that during our general discussion. The exhibition itself in Australia, in the National Museum of Australia in Canberra, which followed the following year in 2016, was very different in the way that it was framed and also the audience that it sought to speak to. So whereas the inside cover of the BM catalogue had a reproduction of rock art speaking to the immemorial nature of Aboriginal people's presence on the Australian continent, the National Museum of Australia catalogue had the piecing, and Tony reproduced it in his presentation yesterday, piecing large-scale portraits staring directly at the reader. The inside leaf of the Australian catalogue quoted an Indigenous Australian elder, Dalawa woman, Shane Williams, stating, in a spiritual sense, it would be good to hold on to them again, that is the material object, or the objects in the exhibition itself, just the way our ancestors held them even in 1770. For us, we feel like they are our national treasure. The curators of the exhibition themselves also spoke about the importance of ensuring that, and this is very much reflected in the catalogue itself, whereas the BM catalogue is more of a traditional catalogue in the way that it is presented. The Australian catalogue, which covers and is entitled, the exhibition was entitled Encounters, has large, significant sections of quoting directly from Aboriginal elders from which those objects were drawn. So contemporary quotes, and indeed this was also reflected in the exhibition itself. So at the conclusion of this, and when they were speaking about this is the curators quoted again a Bunda elder, June Carter from Fitzroy Crossing, when she spoke about the importance of the material culture, the cultural objects and materials within the exhibition and in the BM collections themselves. And I'll quote this directly. It's very much around the whole reconstruction of the community, the whole healing of families and communities from what people's experience was. It is very timely that the material is coming back to their country and place of origin, and hopefully to be reconnected with the people and place. It is very timely, and it is part of the healing process for everyone. And I think that non-Aboriginal people and the National Museum and the British Museum also need to be aware that this is not just returning the material. This is in fact part of a larger story, a larger healing process. So to conclude, I'd like to very specifically talk about, and I think this is what Wayne is challenging us to do in our talks this morning, is what this means, both for us, for me as an international lawyer, and for those that work with these collections. And I'll briefly speak to various episodes here, and hopefully it will resonate with you. So in a series of lectures in 1968, entitled After the Dreaming, anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner spoke of the great Australian silence, the lack of consciousness of Indigenous people's plight and their history within the broader Australian community and Australian history as it was being told. So he talked about, and this was at a time, the year preceding, in 1967, when there was a referendum, and hence the link to law, where there was a referendum on constitutional change where, for the first time, Indigenous Australians would be counted in the census in Australia. So they, in effect, were not counted as Australians until 1967. So, and this is where I refer to, in my abstract, the work of Avishai Margli, where he talks about at great length and very sympathetically about the ethical obligation to remember. And I think at this moment, when European museums are looking at, particularly ethnographic museums, are looking at their colonial past, I would challenge you to think about your ethical duty to remember. So my duty, and this is what Margli talks about, is that this ethical duty only relates to thick relations. And I would say, as an Australian, a woman that lives and works on Gadigal, with Gadigal people from the Eora Nation on their land, I understand that my thick relations with Indigenous Australians, and that is the relationship between the Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians, relates to my presence on their land and the acknowledgement of my presence on their land. So this is the commitment to remembering what occurred, and I'll come back to this at the end of my talk. I would challenge you to say that your thick relationships, so far away from the Australian continent, relates to, in relation to Indigenous peoples, relates to your control of collections of their ancestral remains, their secret sacred objects, their cultural, material, culture and intangible heritage through records. These thick relations relate not just because you hold these collections, but also the way in which these collections were acquired. That is, the moral and legal wrongs which were visited upon them. So Siraj spoke about stewardship, and I'm happy to, when we have the discussion, also discuss that in more detail as it relates to international law. But I would say that more appropriately is the term responsibility. That is the responsibility or the duty to remember that arises in relation to these collections. So your relationship is not simply a one-to-one relationship. The relationship arises because you have access to and control over these materials. You have to care for in the way in which you keep, display and interpret these materials in accordance with the wishes of the communities from which they came, including perhaps return if they ask for it. So this responsibility to remember is tied to recollection and remembering because of our obligation as a moral or ethical society. So Avishai Mugli talks about this as relating to not about justice, which he sees as quite idealistic and not always attainable. Rather, the importance of being in a decent society, or indeed having ethical relations or a moral community, relates to being free of humiliation. And to that end, and I think that is our responsibility, to be conscious of how our relationships, whether it be being on land of people who have been subjected to this, or being custodians of collections of material culture and the histories that arises from. I'd like to speak to the need to, and something that one of our former Prime Ministers, and it's the 25th anniversary of his acknowledgement on behalf of the Australian people of the humiliation it visited on Indigenous Australians, and hope you'll bear with me. I'm going to speak from an iPhone, sorry, and I apologise for this. So I'll read it directly, and hopefully it'll have some resonance for you. So as I say, and this was delivered in 1993 at the commencement of the International Year of Indigenous Peoples. And as I say, the starting point might be to recognise that the problem starts with us, non-Indigenous Australians. It begins with an act of recognition that it was us who did the dispossessing, who took the lands and smashed the traditional way of life, who brought the disease, the alcohol, committed the murders, who took the children from their mothers, practiced discrimination and exclusion. It was our ignorance and our prejudice, our failure to imagine these things could be done to us. With some noble exceptions, we failed to make the most basic human response and enter into their hearts and minds. We failed to ask, how would we feel this was done to me? As a consequence, we have failed to see what we were doing degraded us all. So my challenge to you is, and I know I've spoken much about a community that's very far from the other side of the world, but they are represented in your collections, and for that reason, we similarly need to recognise the impact in which our ongoing presence, in case of land, but also our ongoing custodianship of these cultures has in relation to these communities more broadly. So thank you very much.